Welcome everyone. This is Libby Mucciaroni, Member Engagement and Education Manager at the Organic Trade Association. I'm pleased to welcome you to our webinar, Biodiversity and Profitability on Organic Farms, Environmental and Economic Benefits of Organic Practices. This webinar is presented by Dr. Amber Sciligo of the Organic Center, Dr. David Crowder of the Washington State University, and Dr. Olivia Smith of the University of Georgia. You can learn more about our speakers in the handout within our platform. The Organic Center is a nonprofit research and education organization based out of Washington, D.C. They work to conduct and convene credible, evidence-based science on the environmental and health effects of organic food and farming and communicate the findings to the public. The Organic Center's work is supported by companies and individuals who desire a sustainable and secure food system that promotes the health of humans and the environment. A couple of things before we begin today. This webinar is being recorded. In the next 24 hours, all registrants will receive a follow-up email including PDF slides of the presentation, handouts, and other helpful links provided in the platform today, and a registration link to view today's recording. Included in the platform are 5 handouts, as I mentioned. 3 are papers that Drs. Smith and Crowder are sharing with you. In addition, you can find a resource document from the Organic Center on publications completed by both the Organic Center and the Organic Trade Association, and other relevant links on today's topic. And as I mentioned, you can also find biographical information on our 3 speakers there as well. During registration, we ask that you let our presenters know any questions that you had on today's topic. With over 500 registrants and over 50 questions, and more than 130 of you already in attendance today, we are so thankful to have such a diverse and engaged audience. Many of these questions that you submitted have been taken into account in both today's presentation and in preparation for our Q&A session following the presentation. For any questions or comments that you may have during the presentation today, please share them with us in the questions box on the platform. Our presenters will respond to your questions as time permits during our Q&A session. And for any questions that are not addressed today, our staff will follow up within the next week. And finally, if you happen to have any technical issues during the presentation today, please notify us through the questions panel, or you can email me directly. And with that, I'd like to hand the presentation over to my colleague, Dr. Amber Sciligo. She's the Associate Director of Science Programs at the Organic Center. Hi, Amber.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can. It's good to have you here. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks so much, Libby. Yeah, I'm always so excited to do these webinars and also really impressed with the size and the diversity of the audience that we have. And I just wanted to thank all of you for tuning in today. We're going to stay on this slide for a little bit, even though I'm going to give an overview of what we're doing today. And I'll just go ahead and dive in and start by saying that, there is a lot of science out there that shows all the different ways that organic farming can increase lots of different types of biodiversity. Profitability of organic, on the other hand, is a little bit less studied, but there is science out there that reveals, many organic systems across the world actually can be more profitable than conventional farming. Today, the 3 of us that are presenting will tie these 2 topics together because there's really this feedback loop that exists between biodiversity and profitability. So in other words, organic practices will promote biodiversity that provides beneficial services back to the farm, and then that feeds back into profitability for the farmer. Today, I'll start off by highlighting some of the research that shows how organic farming can be more profitable and how it can also support rural communities. And then I'll move into the importance of biodiversity and some of the recommendations that are offered to farmers that can help them promote biodiversity on their farms, whatever their farms might look like. And from there, I'll pass it on to Dr. Crowder, who will give us all a more detailed update on the science that's out there related to biodiversity and profitability. And finally, we will hear from Dr. Smith, who will take a deeper dive into the connection between these 2 topics with a recent publication that she led. All right, so let's move to the first slide there, Libby. Great, so let's talk about profitability. We all know that farming in general can be tough financially. In most cases, the profit margins are very thin. And now, when we're in this COVID pandemic, we are seeing market outlets that are closing, like schools, school kitchens, and other industrial kitchens and restaurants. And so there is even more concern for farmers. However, I'll say that organic has offered sort of this ray of hope for a lot of farmers who just cannot keep up with this race that we have to the bottom for cheap food. Organic is the fastest growing sector of the US food industry. It has sales that are increasing by double digits annually, which is far outpacing the growth rate for the overall food market. Organic crops also command a significant price premium over conventionally grown crops. And because of this, a lot of farmers are becoming more interested in organic production, particularly as the demand for organic has risen and continues to rise. Next slide. And we have scientists coming in from all over the world that shows how transitioning to organic farming can improve farmer livelihoods. But there was this important study that came out recently, and it was conducted in the United States, and it found that organic hotspots can positively impact local economies and not just an individual organic farmer. In this study, organic hotspots were defined as counties that had high levels of organic agricultural activity that were also surrounded by other neighboring counties that had high levels of organic activity. So this study used spatial statistics to identify the location of these counties that were considered organic hotspots versus just general agricultural hotspots. And then they analyzed that spatial data in combination with economic data to see if there were any economic benefits that could be associated with organic hotspots. Next slide. And what they found is that organic hotspots were associated with lower county level poverty rates and higher median household income. So what you're seeing here is that on average, the county poverty rates dropped by 1.2 percentage points, and the median household income rose by over $1,000 in these counties that were considered organic hotspots. And the same beneficial results were not found for general agricultural hotspots. So these results are really important because for two reasons. One, they show that the benefits move beyond the organic farm and it sort of trickle down per se throughout the supply chain in the community. And two, these results could incentivize policymakers who are trying to promote economic growth in rural areas to specifically focus on organic development rather than the more general development of agriculture. This study did not dig into the reasons why organic is more profitable, but that's something that we're going to discuss today throughout the rest of the presentation. And I will say that biodiversity can have something to do with it. So yeah, let's circle back and we'll talk about why biodiversity matters. First off, the conservation of natural resources and biodiversity is a primary tenet of organic production. Organic farming is a system that is fundamentally different from industrialized conventional farming. It's not linear or reductionist, and organic systems have to find a way to work with nature instead of against it, and then also try to find a way to harness the benefits that can come from biodiversity, both in their fields and surrounding their farms. So for instance, non-crop vegetation that's interspersed throughout a farm can provide really important food resources and natural habitat for lots of different types of beneficial organisms like birds and bees, natural predators, and even beneficial fungi and microbes that can help fight diseases in plants and in the soil. So above and below ground biodiversity provide really important functions that support this whole system balance that organic farming really relies on for its success and profitability. Broadly speaking, when biodiversity is working together and providing that whole system function, there are several benefits that farmers can receive. And those include a reduced reliance on inputs to help them manage their soil fertility, reduced pest management costs that are associated with usually chemical control of insect pests and soil diseases. They can receive better pollination, healthier soils, and more reliable sources of clean water. In addition to the benefits that directly impact crop yields, vegetative diversity, right down to that microbial diversity, can contribute to healthier soils. And healthy soil means that farmers will have increased nutrient cycling. There will be more carbon storage that can help mitigate climate change. There's better water holding capacity in that soil that reduces erosion, but it also increases tolerance to flooding and drought by absorbing water and holding on to it. And then also we get more filtration and pollution that results in cleaner water runoff. In essence, a lot of the biodiversity that is benefiting the farmer on their farm also benefits nearby communities and society as a whole. And that's just talking about the environmental side of things in addition to the economic side of things we just mentioned. Because biodiversity is so important for farming at multiple levels, the National Organic Program requires farmers to maintain or improve biodiversity on their farms in order for them to receive and keep their organic certification. So there are some terms in this rule that are pretty key, and I'll clarify their definitions. You can just read along if you want, because I put them on the slide for you. But I'll start with natural resources of the operation. Those are defined as the physical, hydrological, and biological features of an operation, which includes soil, water, wetlands, woodlands, and wildlife. Organic production is defined as a production system that is managed to respond to site-specific conditions by integrating cultural, biological, and mechanical practices that will foster the cycle of resources. It will promote ecological balance, and it will conserve biodiversity. So biodiversity conservation is inherent in the definition of organic farming. And finally, the use of the word conserve in this definition of organic production establishes that the producer must initiate practices to support biodiversity and avoid, to the extent that's practicable, any activities that would diminish it. Great, so while it's all said and good that we have this rule that requires biodiversity is maintained or supported, farmers need some sort of guidance on how they can actually achieve that in a real world situation. The National Organic Standards Board, NOSB, is a federal advisory committee that advises the USDA on organic issues as well as the National Organic Program. And NOSB has made multiple recommendations that are related to natural resources conservation and biodiversity. They also provide guidance that gives farmers and certifiers examples of these activities that would fulfill that requirement to conserve biodiversity. The list of practices that they have is pretty extensive, and I believe we gave the link in the handout so that you can have access to the document for the full list if you're interested, but I'll just name a few that are mentioned here. So farmers can add organic matter to the soil by diversifying crops and inputs like compost and green manure. They can use no-till or permanent cover, conservation tillage, cover crops, and windbreaks. They can create, conserve, or restore vegetative covers, and they give examples like forests or grasslands, riparian areas, or wetlands. And they can maintain or improve a diverse mix of crop and non-crop plants that will provide important resources for beneficial organisms. And it's important that farmers design and use management strategies as much as possible to repel rather than destroy intended and also unintended species. I'll highlight too that there are some recommendations that are specific to livestock operations that encourage the coexistence of their livestock with wildlife. And so some of those include composing their pasture of diverse species and managing them in a way that supports both the livestock and native species, and also to use non-lethal predator control before lethal. So they give examples like using guard animals, grazing large and small animals together, or housing vulnerable animals overnight. So with this extensive list, farmers have a wide range of practices that they can choose from so they can promote biodiversity on their farms in ways that make sense for their own operations. Because every operation is different, and ultimately the strategies that farmers use have to be feasible and economic for them to implement up front before they start reaping those benefits that biodiversity can provide. Next slide. Okay, so farmers, they have some control over the practices they use in their fields, but the landscape that surrounds them is also really important when it comes to biodiversity, and farmers generally have less control over what that looks like. So in this slide here, there are two different landscape contexts that I'm showing you. These are aerial images that have been translated so that agricultural land is represented in brown, in the color brown, and the natural habitat is represented in green. The landscape matrices on, I believe it's your left, they are dominated by agricultural land, while those that are on the right are dominated by natural habitat. So you can imagine that if there were a farm that were situated in one or the other of these landscape contexts, the pool of biodiversity could be very different. Landscapes that have more natural habitat can provide a larger source of beneficial biodiversity, and landscapes that are really agriculturally intensive can become a mass attractant of agricultural pests. Next slide. When we then consider that farms can range from very simplified to very diversified at a local level, and then we add in the complexity of that landscape, we end up with this large gradient of local and landscape complexity. And there are lots of interactions that exist between these two contexts. The photos here that you see are just specialized and diversified farms in both of these landscape contexts. I would say that more and more research is now considering these interactions and how they affect biodiversity as well as ecosystem services. And we will hear a little bit more about that very soon. For my final point, I just wanted to quickly mention that not all biodiversity is welcomed with open arms. It's impossible to be fully selective when we try to manage wildlife, and it's also impossible to only attract beneficial organisms. This is especially true when there are groups of organisms that can be both beneficial and cause damage. So birds are a good example of this because many birds are extremely helpful in controlling insect pests on farms, and some can also be pests themselves when they eat the crops. It's just really hard to manage vegetation in a way that attracts only the species that we want and to get them to do only what we want them to do. So we're going to talk about this a little bit more, I think, in the discussion, but for now, I just wanted to acknowledge that trade-offs do exist and that we do need more research that considers ecosystem disservices in addition to services, and particularly when we're measuring profitability. So with that, I will let Dr. Crowder tell you more about the science that's out there related to biodiversity and profitability. Thanks.
Can you see me and hear me okay?
Yeah, we can see and hear you both, David. Thanks.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Amber, for the introduction, and Libby for helping organize this. As Amber said, we're going to transition a little. I know we have a diverse group of folks on this webinar. Over 200 people interested in different aspects of organic farming, and I'll try to cover some of the science about how we've seen in the last couple decades how organic farming stacks up to other systems in terms of providing biodiversity and other services that are important to people. So next slide, please. Amber covered this a little bit, but ecosystem services, if you're not familiar with those terms, are services and benefits that are provided to humans from natural and agricultural ecosystems. And so these can be things such as the production of food and water, regulating services such as control of climate or disease. And ecosystem services can also be cultural, reaping spiritual or recreational benefits from nature and from different ecosystems. And so one of the things that organic does a good job of is considering more holistic approaches to not just generate yield, which is an ecosystem service, but also thinking about natural services such as energy efficiency, nutrient cycling, pollination, biological control. As people were also interested in biodiversity just from a conservation aspect, there's a natural aesthetic benefit, pleasing benefit to have more species and in different ecosystems. This has been seen in farms that do things like agro-tourism, and actually are using their diversity to kind of bring visitors into the farm. And then, of course, we're also interested in sustainability overall. And when you have systems that are providing services, they often also are more sustainable. So next slide, please. So a few slides that Olivia and I will talk about focus on communities of organisms. And I just wanted to show this slide to show that this is not necessarily a completely straightforward process, but these are some of the things that we're looking for as scientists when we're going out and assessing communities of organisms on farms or in natural systems that denote whether or not communities are quote unquote healthy or not. And so I've used an example from our lab studies pollinators as one system, and so I focused on showing some pollinators here and these 4 different concepts. Abundance is probably a concept that most people are familiar with, obviously, and think about. If you have just more bees, for example, on a farm, that would be considered a better pollination system than if you only have a single individual bee. But that's only one aspect of a community. You also have these things such as species richness, which is the number of unique species. And generally, when you have more unique species, they're providing unique services to humans or to agriculture. And so that can be beneficial. You also have stability, which is kind of the variation in abundance of organisms over time. And if you have a lot of variation in abundance over time, that can be bad for productivity. And then the final term that I'll mention briefly is this evenness, which is kind of the distribution of different organisms. And communities that have more balance among the different organisms tend to be healthier as well. Next slide, please. And so one of the things to keep in mind is in agricultural systems, they're often, from a distance thought of, especially monocultures, that they might not have a lot of diversity, but if you get and walk into any kind of agricultural field, those of you that are farmers know, there's a lot of different organisms that you'll start to see. As an entomologist, my focus is often on insects, but, especially as you branch out into looking at plant diversity, soil diversity, microbe diversity, there's a lot going on systems that we need to quantify if we try to understand which individual species are providing these services, which groups do we need to conserve, and what are really important for regulating our environmental practices. And so just within pollinators, for example, people often just think about bees, but you also have groups like butterflies here, flies, beetles, and other individual species that will contribute to services such as pollination. Can you go to the next slide, please? And organic farms often offer a unique mix of spatial and temporal resources that differ from monoculture, big business farming. Even though a lot of organic agriculture is big business, you also have within the organic sector a lot more small farms, I think, that are diversified like this, where you have crops that are blooming throughout the year, a lot of spatial diversity, where we don't have just a single crop grown over the whole farm, but, just a few rows of a bunch of different things. And so these types of systems often have unique resources that have unique needs compared to monoculture. So we try to keep that in mind when we're comparing different kinds of systems. Okay, next slide, please. So I just want to go through a few data slides here to talk about what are the effects that we've seen of organic agriculture on these ecosystem services. And one of the approaches that my lab has used, and other labs as well, and Olivia will touch on this later on in the talk, is an approach called meta-analyses, and this is where you gather data from individual studies conducted around the world or in specific regions, and then you try to extrapolate data from a lot of individual studies to make broad conclusions. And so shown here is a study that we conducted recently that looked at the effects of organic as compared to conventional agriculture on biodiversity, carbon sequestration in the soil, crop yields, as well as profitability. And so these circles indicate individual studies that might be, for example, looking at the yield of organic and conventional corn in the Midwestern United States, or the biodiversity of organisms on coffee plantations in South America. And we take all of those data from all these different studies and look at it holistically to try to say overall, what are the benefits or trade-offs comparing organic to conventional agriculture across all of these different metrics. And I'm happy to answer questions about how we do this, but in general, we're trying to compare systems that are very similar. They're growing the same crops in the same regions, types of soil. So next slide, please. So the next few graphs all look the same, and so I'll just walk through kind of the structure of these graphs once, and then we'll go through these results. So in every one of these graphs, the y-axis shows the effect size here, and this is a statistic from these meta-analysis tools that compare organic to conventional systems that are growing the same crops in the same kind of environmental region. And so everything is standardized here by the crops in the region. The dashed line at 0 indicates that there's no difference between an organic farming system and a conventional farming system in terms of whatever the metric is we're looking at. So anytime these values are above 0, it means that the organic systems are performing more effectively than the conventional system at boosting that service. And anytime the values are below 0, it indicates that the organic systems are not performing as well as the conventional systems. And so in this particular graph, it's just looking at abundance and richness of organic systems, and we see about a 35% increase in the abundance of organisms and about a 25% increase in the number of species on organic versus conventional farms. Okay, so go to the next slide. Amber mentioned we wanted to break this down further into beneficial organisms, or organisms that we typically view as beneficial as people, versus pests. Sometimes if you have an organic system, if you're just getting more organisms, but they're all pests, that's not a good scenario. So we looked at pollinators, and here you can see in both terms of the number of individuals as well as the number of species, you get about 50% more pollinators in organic systems and about 25% more individual predators as well as species of predators. So these are organisms that we generally think of as doing services for humans in terms of pollination or natural pest control. So we see big boosts in these beneficial organisms on organic fields. Next slide, please. But when we look at herbivores, they're less impacted. So the worst case scenario is that organic farms just boost pests, but that doesn't really seem to happen, that we actually seem to get these nice increases in beneficial organisms and small increases in herbivores, but this is not statistically significant. So pests communities, overall, the evidence is not there that they're more abundant pest communities in organic farms, although certain groups of pests like weeds do tend to be more abundant on organic versus conventional farms. All right, next slide. The evenness of organisms also increases in organic farms. This is a little bit more of a nuanced concept, but what this means is that organic farms compared to conventional farms tend to be less dominated by single species. They have a more diverse mixture of species that is more balanced in general. Next slide. We've also shown that soil carbon and carbon sequestration, so the amount of carbon that's sequestered in the soil, is higher in organic farms. Again, this is a new study, and Olivia will talk about it a little bit, that again confirm kind of our results with abundance and richness of organisms. We also see benefits to healthy soils from organic farming, and that's highlighted here with about a 15% boost in soil carbon in organic compared to conventional farms. Okay, next slide. Yields tend to be lower in organic cropping systems, and so I think there's been about 5 meta-analyses now that have shown this general result, that organic farm yields tend to be about 20% lower on average than conventional systems. This does vary quite a bit depending on the type of system. But in general, organic farms produce lower yields. This is a question we'll answer more in detail later. The focus of organic farms is not necessarily totally on yield, obviously, and so there are aspects of this that are quite controversial, as people like to talk about whether or not organic agriculture can feed the world or not, and this is often cited as a negative. Organic doesn't produce as high enough yields, but I think if you look at the overall data, organic agriculture in general will produce more than enough food if we got rid of food waste and other distributional issues, that this yield issue would not be as big of a problem. All right, next slide, please. Yeah, so despite the lower yields, however, we see that organic farming is about 30% more profitable than conventional farming. And so as Amber mentioned, all of us are aware farming is a low margin business. It's a difficult business to be in, especially now with some of the things that are going on. And so organic does provide an opportunity and for farmers to make increased profitability. Next slide, please. And one of the reasons for this is due to the price premiums. And so what we show here is on the left where it says the actual premiums. These are the average premiums that farmers get and the black circles show individual crops, and the diamonds show entire farming systems. And so typically organic farmers get premiums where they're selling their products about 30% higher prices than conventional counterparts. And this could be in the grocery store or at farmers markets or CSAs. But the profitability where it says break even, that's the actual premiums that are needed for organic farmers to break even. Again, this is going to vary by system, so this is a very broad global look. But what we see here is that even if organic premiums were only about 5 to 10% higher than conventional, that's about the break-even point where organic farmers would break even with conventional farmers. So this tells us that there's a lot of room for organic agriculture to expand, both in the United States and globally. Even if it did expand quite a bit and those price premiums came down, we still project that organic farming in a lot of cases would be more profitable than conventional. Next slide, please. Finally, I just wanted to kind of show what are some of the factors that matter for profitability, and some of this mirrors biodiversity as well. And just showing these different slides are comparing different crops on the left-hand panels and cropping systems on the right. And I just wanted to point out a couple things which are that farmers can control. So as you increase the diversity of your cropping systems, this is in terms of the crops actually planted. So as farmers move away from monocultures to more diversified crop rotations or diverse crop fields, the profitability of organic farming systems increases. So we see that organic farmers that produce diverse mixtures of crops have better outcomes than those that produce single crops. And then the second two graphs that show the length of the rotation show that when organic systems have longer rotations compared to conventional systems, they get significantly greater profitability. And so there seems to be a benefit in terms of diversifying and lengthening your rotations to profitability. Next slide. Very quickly, just to kind of close, this is some work that was done at a Washington State University by some other labs looking at other metrics. This is what we call a flower diagram, and the outer edge of the circle indicates what we think is kind of optimal productivity of our agricultural system. So we're achieving near optimal yields or nutritional quality. And this is comparing conventional to organic farming systems across a lot of different metrics. And some of this is a little bit qualitative, but if you look at the graph on the left, conventional farming really tends to maximize yield and nutritional quality and minimize costs, but at the expense of some other metrics such as soil quality or biodiversity. And if you look at the right on organic farming, organic tends to kind of maximize more aspects of sustainability simultaneously. And so while yields might be slightly lower, organic farms have tended to reduce worker exposure to pesticides, for example, be more profitable, minimize pollution, and promote biodiversity. So overall, the evidence does suggest that organic ag is meeting a lot of the goals that it was designed to meet. So next slide. So this is just very quickly to close, then I'll turn to Olivia. Why does all this matter? And we know that diversity can improve ecosystem function. When you have more species, whatever the function might be, it can improve that function. Next slide, please. So I just want to show one example of this. This is an insect we work with, the Colorado potato beetle, and you can see just the picture of this potato that's completely defoliated. It's a really voracious feeder that's attacked by a lot of different species of predators. So can you go to the next slide? And just experimentally, we've shown that, if you go out into systems and there's more natural enemies, they kill more of the potato beetles. So you get fewer pupae in adults. And so this is a very real example just from our own studies that have shown that organic farms actually promote about 30% more natural enemy species on farms. And that relates to about a 15% increase in yield because those natural enemies do a better job of controlling these potato beetles. And so this is from work we've done in Washington, but I think there are a lot of examples where you have these increases in diversity and you get concurrent increases in yield. Next slide. Sorry, go to the next one too. This is just showing yield, but we can skip this in the interest of time. And so I'm going to transition to Olivia here. Some of her focus, and we'll answer questions about this, is how might we actually modify farms? I think this is a important area of research that we need to move into to think about how might we put out structures or change the diversity of our systems or capture benefits from broader landscapes, which Olivia will talk about to make sure we're maximizing these services. So with that, I'll turn it over to.
Thanks, Dave. So today I will cover a recent publication that Dave and I had where we looked at how landscape context influences the sustainability of organic farms. Next slide, please. My portion of the talk, I'll begin by giving a brief terminology review. We have a pretty diverse range of backgrounds of attendees, so I want to make sure everyone is familiar with the terms that I'm using. Talk about our primary questions and hypotheses, the methods for our study, our results, and our conclusions. Next slide, please. So to begin, we'll do terminology. Next slide, please. Dave mentioned a meta-analysis, but I'll go over it briefly again using an example since our study is what's called a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis combines the results of multiple studies to try to get a consensus when studies disagree. So to give you an example that I made up, let's say that you're watching the news in June and the media covers a story that says coffee is good for you. And then you're watching the news again in July and the media reports a new study finds that coffee is bad for you. And then when you're watching the news again in August, the media says a new study finds that coffee is good for you. And this leaves you wondering, is coffee good for me or bad for me? And one way that you can look at this is to use a meta-analysis to look across all of these studies, which might vary using a lot of different methods, having different sample sizes, different time periods, and so forth. And so you can use a meta-analysis to try to provide consensus. And another way that meta-analysis is useful is that you can answer larger scale questions than if you were to do an individual study, where if I'm conducting a study by myself, I might be able to go to one state or two states. But if you're doing a meta-analysis, you can look at global questions. Next slide, please. Next, what's a landscape? we've mentioned landscape a couple times. Just to give a review so that everyone knows what we're talking about, here's an example where there are two farms depicted on the right side of this diagram. And in the left side of the diagram, the farms are represented by a small yellow square. And so when we're talking about landscape, what we mean is what the land usage is in the area around a farm or what the neighbors are doing. And so if you're the farm on the top, your neighbors are managing some forest, there's a little bit of urbanization and a little bit of crop, but it's a pretty natural landscape. And then if you're the farm on the bottom image, your neighbors have a lot of crop and a little bit of urban area without a lot of natural habitat. And so the actions that you have on your farm might be largely influenced by what your neighbors are doing and what organisms are present because of the land use that they're doing. Next slide, please. So to try to show this with some on-the-ground images, let's say that your farm is again in the center of the aerial image on the left in yellow, and the landscape around you or what your neighbors are doing is largely agricultural with some larger fields and not a lot of natural habitat. And so your farm might look like the image on the top right, where you have some nice pollinator habitat, some nice hedges in the background, pretty small crop fields, a little bit of weeds that are nice for arthropods. But then you turn and look around you and your neighbors have the farm on the bottom right, which we'll call scorched earth. And this makes it so that it's hard for animals to reach your farm. Next slide, please. So then let's say that you're in this situation instead, where you're the yellow farm in the center, and around you, your neighbors are primarily maintaining forests. And so you can have the same farm, and then when you look around you, there's forests, and that might provide a lot better of a habitat for biodiversity, making it so that your management actions have a pretty different impact on the biodiversity around you. Next slide, please. So just to briefly review that Dave introduced these terms, in our study we looked at abundance, or the number of individuals, and species richness, or the number of species present. Next slide, please. Now I'll move on to the primary questions and hypotheses for our study. Next slide, please. Our primary question was, how does landscape context influence the difference in biodiversity, yields, and profitability between organic and conventional farming? So to try to illustrate these with some images, what we were interested in is the red arrow. So we're interested in the difference in an organic farm and a conventional farm when they're in the same habitat type compared to the difference in an organic farm and a conventional farm in a different landscape type. So on the top comparison, let's say that your organic farm and your conventional farm are both in what we call an intensified landscape. Where intensified can mean that your neighbors are using a lot of pesticides, your neighbors have large fields, your neighbors don't maintain a lot of habitat. So we're interested in how that organic farm can perform relative to that conventional farm when they're both in the intensified landscape, compared to when the organic and conventional are both in a more natural landscape like the bottom image. Next slide, please. Our hypothesis was that organic farms would have the greatest benefit to biodiversity compared to paired conventional farms found in the same type of landscape when they both are found in intensified landscapes. And so to try to add some biodiversity images to these infographics, if we're looking at the top two aerial images of the intensified landscape, unconventional and organic, you might expect relatively few animals present in the landscapes when it's intensified. And in this situation, let's say there's one cucumber beetle in the landscape. What we think is that that organic farm is going to be really beneficial to biodiversity in those landscapes because it can provide what we call a refuge when there's not a lot of habitat around you. And so the biodiversity in the yellow box is greater in the organic farm. We, however, anticipate that in a more natural landscape or less intensified, there's more biodiversity found in the landscape around you. But your farm might not be as important to those animals because there's a lot of habitat they can use outside of your farm. Next slide, please. So to expand our hypothesis, we reason that if a landscape context influenced the biodiversity gap in organic and conventional farming, and we know that biodiversity can improve the yield gap through biodiversity ecosystem services such as pollination, and yields are an important part of profit margins, then landscape context should influence the yield gap and profit margins in organic versus conventional farming in the same way that it influences the biodiversity gap. Next slide, please. Moving on to how we tested this. Next slide, please. We conducted a meta-analysis where we searched the literature for studies that compared biodiversity, profitability, and yields in paired organic and conventional farms using 11 criteria for inclusion. Next slide, please. We then quantified the landscape around these farms using remotely sensed data where we calculated the amount of crop in the landscape, the field size of the neighbors in the landscape, so not your farm, but the field sizes around you, and crop and natural habitat diversity. And today I'll just talk about the one that mattered, but if you're interested in more details, you can see our publication. Next slide, please. Next, I'll move on to results. Next slide, please. So similar to the other studies that Dave mentioned earlier, we found that organic farms had higher abundance, richness, and profitability, whereas conventional farms had higher yields, similar to what has been reported elsewhere in the literature. Next slide, please. We found that field size in the landscape was the most important predictor of this gap, where organic farms were the most beneficial for biodiversity relative to paired conventional farms when both were surrounded by large fields. However, organic farms had lower yields and the lowest profit margins relative to paired conventional farms when both were surrounded by large fields. So the yield and profitability result respond in the opposite way to biodiversity. Next slide, please. So to return to our infographic, what we found was that the greatest difference in organic and conventional, represented by the red arrow width in the center, was highest, that the organic farm had the highest biodiversity relative to conventional when both were in an intensified landscape. And this is likely because organic farms can provide a refuge for biodiversity when there's not much other habitat around them. And so that really diversified habitat is really important to animals when there's not much else in the landscape. Next slide, please. And like I said, the yield gaps actually respond in the opposite direction. So why would that be the case? Because as we talked about earlier, biodiversity can provide important ecosystem services such as pollination and control of pest insects. Well, it's likely that the biodiversity on the organic farms is still higher in natural landscapes than organic farms in more intensified landscapes. So we're looking at the difference or the ability of organic to promote biodiversity relative to that conventional farm. So what we might actually see is the organic farms on the left side, where the organic farm in the less intensified, more natural landscape actually has more biodiversity total, but it's just not as big of a difference between that organic farm and that conventional farm. And this might be thought of as a situation where the conventional farm is perhaps less detrimental to biodiversity, where if they go through and spray pesticides, for example, the organisms present can move into the natural habitat or the hedges around that farm and move back in once that disturbance is over. Next slide, please. Next, organic farming has been shown to promote rare species, and these rare species might not be the big providers of ecosystem services, but those organic farms can provide cultural ecosystem services and have high conservation value. Next slide, please. And as mentioned at the beginning of the talk, it's impossible to discriminate between the beneficial and the harmful organisms. So if you're creating an oasis for biodiversity, you might get, for example, these flea beetles eating your brassicas. You might attract robins that eat your fruit. They might also be providing some pest control services. And you'll also attract beneficial species like this tree swallow or lady beetles. Next slide, please. And finally, the farm management is important. Other studies have found that organic farms can improve their yields relative to conventional farms through practices such as multi-cropping, longer rotations, growing perennial crops, having high water use efficiency, having good weed control. And the yield gap is also variable by crop types, where production of fruits tends to have the lowest yield gap, and production of vegetables and cereals tend to have the largest yield gap. Next slide, please. So finally, why did profitability respond in the opposite direction? Profitability is estimated factoring in crop yields, production costs, and price premiums. And as we just said, the yields responded similarly to profitability. And it's also possible that the field size metric was an indicator of how rural the farm was. So farms that have smaller field sizes around them might be closer to urban centers. So for example, if you're a farm operating with a CSA, you might be more successful if you're near Seattle that's relatively affluent and willing to pay high price premiums, as opposed to more rural parts of the country that might not be. Next slide, please. So finally, I'll summarize our study. Next slide, please. Overall, organic farming had high benefits for biodiversity and had higher profitability compared to conventional farms across the board. Next slide, please. The best overall outcomes occurred when organic farms were in landscapes with small field sizes. So to return to our aerial images, let's say that you're the farm on the bottom panel labeled D, and you have this nice patchwork organic farm, but you're surrounded by large fields. You likely have a higher increase in biodiversity relative to the conventional farms around you, but you might have lower yields and lowered profitability margins, as opposed to if you're the farm on the top. This is largely agricultural landscape, but these field sizes are pretty small. And so in this situation, you still are promoting more biodiversity than the conventional farms around you, but you also might have higher profitability and lowered yield gaps. Next slide, please. So with that, thank you everyone for attending today, and Libby will take over to start off questions.
Great, thanks so much, Olivia, and I will welcome your other presenters, Amber and Dave, to come on camera. And a reminder to all of you in attendance, please feel free to continue to submit questions. I know there are a lot of you here in attendance, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions. We've already seen so many. And we really do thank you for your time. And to Olivia, Amber, and Dave, thank you, each of you, for all your hard work in preparing this presentation and in being here with each of us. And Dave, when you jump on camera, I'm gonna pitch out the first question right now. I'll see you in just a second, I'm sure. So the first question I have here is, how do you compare profitability between organic farms and non-organic farms when there are so many variables that affect yields?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a really something we take into account when we do these meta-analyses. So these individual studies within a meta-analyses, we have some pretty rigorous criteria on whether or not we'll include them or not. And so it is true that a lot of factors affect yields, but when we're looking at an individual study, oftentimes we're looking at we're always looking at the same crop grown in the same region, where a lot of the production practices are similar, except for whether or not they're using organic versus conventional inputs. And so as many things in the system are controlled as possible, so then we can just compare the effects of the organic practices specifically. So that's typically how we do this in the meta-analysis. We try to control everything except for the organic status.
Do you want to add anything to that, Olivia?
No, that sounded like a good response from Dave.
Okay, great. I wanted to follow up with you, Dave. Just thinking, I know this is probably not something you did in your meta-analysis, but just thinking about all the literature that you've come across, and I mentioned these disservices, these ecosystem disservices, where we have situations where biodiversity and such can influence yield in a negative way. And I'm just wondering what you've been seeing, for both of you, what you've been seeing in this regard, and how you think this is going to fit into like future calculations of profitability.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Amber. And so when we're looking at profitability so far, we're taking a very simplistic approach of, looking at the yields that are produced by farmers and the prices that they're receiving, and subtracting the costs that they're paying to produce those goods. What we're not taking into account, and I think what your question is getting at, is that what if organic farms are producing all these services and decreasing negative externalities, things like soil erosion or pollution or pesticide exposure that are also associated with farming. So right now we don't take those things into account because we don't have good policy mechanisms to reward farmers for promoting ecosystem services or reducing negative externalities. I think if we had policy solutions where farmers were actually paid, for example, to reduce pollution or to mitigate climate change or all the other benefits that organic provides, if we actually monetarily paid farmers to kind of produce services or decrease negative externalities, then I think we would find that the profitability benefits of organic would be even higher. But right now, that's not really included in the free market calculations. But I think it would be great if we did have policy mechanisms to get us to that point.
Yeah, that definitely touches on half of the question. And the other half, I don't know, maybe Olivia, if you want to tackle it, is just thinking about how sometimes we use these organic practices that really benefit biodiversity and we can get yield losses from that. Or you're in a landscape, that has a lot of natural habitat. And I know that there's some work that's out there, but I'm just wondering what your experience and your thoughts are around this. Does that make sense? So for instance, like the example that I gave with birds, like when we have more birds on the farm, and that's considered a good thing, but then we also can have crop losses because we have, or like hedgerows, or, there are all kinds of things where we increase our biodiversity and we increase a lot of positive externalities. And, we hear from farmers all the time that sometimes we get more than what we bargained for. And there can be a negative impact. And so how is that being incorporated into thinking about profitability, in these organic practices?
I think like Dave was saying, we're not really currently accounting for that. We're mostly considering yields rather than, for example, if you're providing a cultural ecosystem service, or maybe your CSA model includes farm tours and people are more attracted to your CSA because they can come and see birds. I don't think we're necessarily at this point able to calculate that based on available data.
I will say, Amber, one thing that has come out is that people are trying to do is to look at those connections between biodiversity and yield or profitability. And so there was just a recent study, and it wasn't focused on organic specifically, that looked at the benefits of hedgerows for pest control and pollination, and found that there was really a big benefit for biological control in terms of reducing pest densities. But although pollinators increased in hedgerows, they didn't necessarily increase pollination of crops. And so I think what your point is that these things are nuanced. We often do have to, we can't just look at biodiversity. We need to look at how that might affect other services such as yield or profitability. And I think more studies are needed to draw those connections, but that is an area of a lot of work, I would say.
Great, thank you guys. Knowing that we are up against time, we have about 2 minutes left. I just sent through a message to everyone letting them know about our future educational opportunities. I know we have so many more questions to cover. I would like to get one more question out there if you guys are good with it on yield that we received. So to those of you that do have to leave, we apologize for going a couple minutes over. Thanks for those of you that can stay with us. And this question, I think all three of you will be able to tackle. There's an assumption by many in academia that organic means less yield and quality. Do you feel that to be true? And can you talk about it more?
It is true that there's an assumption that organic means lower yield. I don't agree with the lower quality. I think the studies that have been done show that organic foods are equally or more nutritious. I think the literature on that is mixed, but there is no evidence that organic food is lower quality, I would say. It has less pesticide residues and is often more, at least equally nutritious to conventional foods. It is true that yields tend to be lower in organic systems, although there's a lot of variability depending on the type of system, from like a 0% yield gap in tree fruit systems to a 20–30% in cereal cropping systems. But yield isn't necessarily the whole end goal. We also see that organic systems have more variability in yield, which I think is an important thing to think about. Not just they don't just get lower yields in general, they tend to have more variable yields. I think that's because it's more of a holistic system where the farmer has to manage so many different things that it's just difficult to get a consistent yield on organic cropping systems. But it is true, I guess, generally that organic produces lower yields, but I think part of that is just due to farmer experience. You know, the yields are much lower typically during the transition period, and then they tend to stabilize the longer farmers can be in organic. So that's a very nuanced question. And I think a big problem that we've had in agriculture is just this all-consuming focus on yield has led us away from looking at things like ecosystem services and the negative externalities that Amber mentioned. And, you know, breeding for conventional systems, you know, just to produce high yielding varieties, those things can be more susceptible to disease and so on and so forth. And so I think we really need to move away from just a singular focus on yield and realize that that's just one aspect of the production system. Amber, Olivia, do you have more thoughts on that question?
Olivia, I'll let you go ahead.
I would just add the point that some studies estimate that there's enough food globally to feed the world. It's more about distribution and waste issues. So because organic has so many benefits besides yield, such as biodiversity, profitability, and so forth, a focus on yields, I think, is a little bit beside the point, since it's kind of the downstream processes are important for ensuring food sustainability.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And also, you know, I don't really have much more to add to both of your thoughts, except that I recently came across a study that was talking about how we frame life cycle assessments, where, you know, we're trying to get a sense of how much energy is used in one system versus another. And we often compare organic to conventional with the global warming potential, how much energy is consumed. And yield is always the measurable thing that we use against the other, but we're not considering all these other benefits, these ecosystem services and such, that we don't necessarily, we're not there, like you said, David, with putting a monetary value on all of these things. And so it's hard to make these comparisons, but it's kind of like comparing apples to oranges in some cases. You know, like the yields in an organic system, because of the whole system, is just so different from comparing the yields to the conventional system. So right. Yeah, I just think that how we think about yield, especially in organic, we just can't really compare it to conventional.
Right, and I think another thing to keep in mind is that, you know, conventional ag and organic ag are really, really diverse. And so, you know, I think when a lot of people think about organic ag, they think about small, diverse farms. But, you know, some organic farms are large monocultures as well. And so there's a lot of variation in what an organic farm is. You know, it's not just a singular thing. And so I do think you need to look kind of system by system at a lot of the overall benefits and how it fits into the community and things like that. And I think that was a question, and, you know, I know we're out of time, but and we didn't really get a chance to talk about this, but one thing that does need a lot more research is, you know, the social impact of farming. You know, how does this affect, you know, human well-being and safety and mental health? And I think the few studies on that have shown that organic might have some societal benefits as well. And so I think that's an area of future research that could complement these studies on yield and stuff is really looking at how farming systems affect human well-being.
Yeah, great point. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, all three of you, so much for combining so much wealth of knowledge together in one space for a little over an hour. We really appreciate all of the hard effort and time that each of you have put in, and all the research over the years to prepare for not just today's presentation, but for your work in general. Thanks to all of you in attendance for joining us today. The Organic Trade Association is a membership-based organization for the organic industry. We ensure that all parts of the organic value chain have a strong voice in government and in our communities. And as is witnessed today, we bring farmers, processors, distributors, retailers, and others together to promote and protect the growing organic sector. OTA represents its members to government on sector needs, market development and promotion, and strong organic standards and regulations. Members receive the latest information and quick answers on organic regulations and standards in the US and around the world. Thanks to all of our Organic Trade Association members in attendance today. To our non-members, we hope you found today's presentation educational and valuable and consider joining us. As a reminder, slides and a link to register to view the recording will be emailed out in the next 24 hours. On behalf of the Organic Trade Association and the Organic Center, we hope you join us for future educational opportunities, and please have a wonderful day. Thanks so much. Thanks all three of you.
Thanks everyone.